Hello and welcome to Strategic Alternatives, the RBC Capital Markets podcast, where we uncover new ways to raise capital, drive growth, and create value in an ever-changing world. Today we revisit our geopolitical panel discussion that took place at RBC's Global Financial Institutions Conference here in New York. It was hosted by Frances Donald, RBC's chief economist, and she was joined by Fred Kempe, president and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and our own Helima Croft, lead geopolitical expert and head of global commodity strategy and MENA research here at RBC Capital Markets. Together, they explored the top geopolitical risks shaping today's landscape and the road ahead, breaking down how evolving power dynamics are influencing the macro environment, impacting global markets, and driving key business decisions in 2025. Now, let's dive into the conversation.
Thank you all for joining us here in the room for RBC's Global Financial Institutions Conference here in New York City. I'm Frances Donald, Chief Economist with RBC Capital Markets, and I'm delighted to be joined by Fred, President and CEO of Atlantic Council, and RBC's very own Helima Croft. So I was really trying to put together what questions we would start with, and I realized there's an overwhelming amount of information coming through. And in our experience, sitting in the boardrooms and C-suites talking with our clients across North America in the past few weeks, what struck me is the overwhelming amount of uncertainty that so many decision makers feel. There is, Helima, as you put it, analysis paralysis and an inability to make large-scale investment or hiring decisions as companies try to get a sense of what matters and what doesn't. So I thought I'd start at the beginning and ask both of you, what are the top three things that should make the list in terms of the mind space that folks should be putting towards geopolitical events? And Fred, I'm going to start with you.
We're facing a tectonic shift geopolitically. The context would have been the same whether it was President Trump or President Harris. That doesn't change. You have war in Europe, war in the Middle East, now ceasefire, tensions with China, a battle for the commanding heights of artificial intelligence, of technology. It's probably the most fraught, most volatile geopolitical year of any of our lifetimes. And so, number one, I would just say the context in any case was fraught and uncertain. Then the second part of this is Donald Trump has thrown the chessboard on the floor, and he's rearranging the pieces. He's a bit ahistorical, and so he may not pay attention to secondary consequences. And so in the Middle East, the worry there is refugees in Egypt and Jordan. And so the first thing is the context is dangerous and fraught. The second thing is Donald Trump comes into this and can make it better or can make it worse, but he's not going to leave it the same. There's no way that this president of the United States is going to leave things the same. And then the third element is everyone's looking so much at all of this and not enough at technology. And I think artificial intelligence will disrupt the world more in the next 4 years than Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping. And so I think perhaps in this conversation, we ought to talk a little bit about that as well.
Well, I don't know if I have three things either. But first of all, I want to say it's just a radically different administration in terms of who's in office. I remember being at one of your events in December, and it's really stuck with me, being on this great panel where we were talking about tariffs. And one of the former Trump administration officials said, look, President Trump thinks about tariffs as a de facto sanction. So he will impose them for non-economic reasons, not having anything to do with trade policy, but to achieve security goals, like, migration, as we've seen, issues around, fentanyl. And I think that was something that took time for people in the markets to wake up to, that he was thinking about sanctions just in a very, very different way. And he does have this ability. I was actually in Saudi Arabia right when they announced the ceasefire. And at first, everyone was like, this is amazing. Like, he can use blunt force to get things done in a way that sort of the more deliberative administrations that get tripped up in their own heads, like, may not be able to move things forward. But as Fred mentioned, then the kind of questions about, how does this all end? Watching how this evolves is going to be very important. But when I think about my markets in terms of oil markets, I'm paying very close attention to Iran. I think Iran either does a deal with President Trump, but if you look at the progress they're making on their nuclear program, using high-speed centrifuges or stockpile of highly enriched uranium, lack of inspector access, like it raises the prospect of them moving forward really rapidly with bomb construction. And when I was in the Middle East, you heard people saying, like, we're starting to become increasingly concerned that the Israelis might take military action to shut this down. And so I think we're not done with the potential wild card of some type of military confrontation involving Iran. So that's something I'm watching very, very closely. Obviously, on the Russia-Ukraine story, the question is sanctions relief. Is there some, deal that gets done, almost a separate piece between the United States and Russia, where the U.S. moves forward with sanctions relief, whereas Europe, being very committed to Ukraine, essentially says, no, we're going to keep the sanctions architecture in place. We see Russia as a malign actor, and we're going to codify the move away from Russian energy. We've sanctioned oil. We're looking at gas as well. So are we going to end up in a situation where Europe is in one place in the near term and the United States is in another place? And that could have really big implications for energy markets.
There's so much to dive in here. We've got tariffs. And I have to tell you, as an economist, lately it's been feeling like our profession is somewhat ill-equipped to deal with tariffs. It sounds like an economic concept, but this is not 2018 at all. We did have tariffs in 2018, and it raised the average import duty from 1.5% to 3%, which at the time was meaningful. But the tariffs that came and raised it to almost 12%. That's a quadrupling of what we experienced in 2018. And even in the basic back of the envelope calculations, we know that has a nonlinear impact on the economy. We know that Americans are in a different space than they were in 2018. Prices are up 30% since Trump's first day in office. And then, Fred, you mentioned this, Helima, you mentioned this. It seems like economists can't help us with tariffs as much as they could have in the past because the motivations don't appear to be economic. What is the market missing in terms of the motivation behind this new transformative trade policy?
Our analysis is there are three ways that the Trump administration is going to use tariffs. And the market has come to the conclusion that the tariffs are not just for negotiation. If the markets are Trump's scorecard, he's going to have to start thinking about whether his tariffs are the right way to go at the moment. Here's the three ways. Tariffs is negotiating. I think he's still going to use them that way. And I think that's primarily the way they'll be used with China. Tariffs as tariffs. Well, what are tariffs supposed to do? They can be revenue bringers, that you actually get money from people paying tariffs. They can also be a realignment where people decide to produce something that they weren't going to produce before domestically because the cost now makes it worthwhile. One kind of can counteract the other, but it takes a while for tariffs as tariffs to pay off. And then the last part is what Helima was talking about, which is tariffs as punishment, tariffs as sanctions. This is totally new terrain. And so this is a stick where we don't really know the ultimate economic impact. Markets don't like to hear this. It's too chaotic for American business. They need more certainty. We feel like we're in month 20 of this administration. We're not. And so what I'm saying to everybody is, this is all really exciting. We get stirred up. There's never been a president control the news cycle the way this one does. Let's calm down. Let's actually watch facts on the ground. Let's see where it goes. This may be a great trading opportunity for U.S. stocks. Who knows? But that's the way we're looking at tariffs. And anyone who thinks they're not going to be used and they're just a negotiating tactic, I think we've seen that markets in the last 2 days have decided that's not true, and markets happen to be right.
Very challenging for businesses to have a playbook for their business when they don't even know what game they're playing. I think some clarity there would be useful. Helima, tariffs are in play. What are we missing? And I was hoping you could comment a little bit on energy tariffs.
It's been very confusing when you think about what does Trump actually want on energy? I always say he wants everything everywhere all at once. If he comes out and is like, American energy dominance, I want to massively unlock US potential, pulls off regulations, which is great for the industry. But at the same time, he's like, I want substantially lower prices. We did this great series with the Atlantic Council in the run up to the elections. And a number of officials were throwing out, we want WTI at $50. And I was like, have you called any American CEOs of shale companies and asked them if they want $50 oil? That is not the price point for massive US production growth. And then you have him making comments in terms of like Canada saying like, we don't need Canadian oil. Like, excuse me, actually, 60% of our imports come from Canada, 4 million barrels. You look at the refinery slate, like you can't swap out Canadian heavies for like US light producing barrels. So there's been a kind of an interesting question about like, when is Chris Wright going to show up as energy secretary and provide a little bit of energy literacy for the White House? So you could say, well, we got the reprieve of, 10%. Maybe that's a little bit of literacy like coming into the White House, but still, it is not great if you are a driver in a Midwestern state and you're potentially paying 15 cents more a gallon for your gasoline because of these tariffs. So it doesn't seem to be sort of, necessarily aligned with the anti-inflationary goals. And then you look at how he's sort of, again, pursuing other countries. There's a really interesting question mark when he came into office. Was he going to, prioritize migration issues and essentially say, Venezuela, let's cut a deal with you. If you take back the Venezuelan migrants, we will allow your sanctions relief that was given by the Biden administration, particularly allowing companies like Chevron to operate there. Will we allow that to continue? More oil on the market, you take the migrants, everything wins. But then there's the politics of Florida for the Republicans. And we saw him come out and say, Chevron, you have to basically unwind your Venezuelan operations in the next 30 days. Well, that's potentially 200,000 barrels not going to find a home. So it's always a question of like, what is a priority? So I think we're headed to a really, really like interesting conversation in terms of like, what is going to work for your goals of like US production? What's going to work for your inflationary goals? And again, like you are going to have to understand that Canada is a very important energy partner of the United States.
This concept of priorities is also flowing in a lot to the economic work as we're trying to get a sense of what is going to be the sequencing of policy. This is really important. So Michael Reed on the team has done a lot of work on the shortage of workers in the United States, not a shortage of jobs. How does immigration flow through? When do the corporate tax cuts come? And part of this market reaction, in our perspective, is also this market realizing we're probably going to get the more difficult things before we get some of the benefits of things like corporate tax cuts and deregulation. So still a lot of noise in a market and a business community that's trying to prioritize.
Really seeing market participants jumping to the conclusion that Trump can bend everything to his will and dictate terms. And that's what I think is going to be really important is like, what are the terms of any of these peace agreements? And is everybody on board? And we've had people, jump right into saying Europe is going to go back to taking Russian gas. They're going to pull off all the sanctions. Trump is going to get this done. And I have to keep saying, let's slow down a bit. Who has put these sanctions in place? And if Europe is committed to moving away from Russian molecules and wants to see, much more security guarantees in terms of like Russia not taking any more territory or moving on any neighboring states, like they're going to keep those sanctions in place. So that has been one of the things that we've been really working on. Just because President Trump has announced his will to get this done does not mean he can get everybody to fall in line on his schedule. And that is the same thing I would say as we think about the Middle East as well. President Trump has been really clear. He wants to be a peacemaker in the Middle East, but I look at the situation with Iran and what we're seeing in terms of reporting from Western intelligence agencies and what I was hearing in the region is there is a real view that Iran is seeking to compress that timeline to have crude nuclear device from like a year to 2 to 3 months. That's a worrying timeline. And if you're the Israelis, is this your moment of opportunity? Or do you want to be in a situation where 2 to 3 months they come out and say, hey, we have this deterrence capability? The Iranians just got rid of their reformist finance minister. Is that a question about like our hardliners potentially becoming more ascendant there? So I think it's going to be really important to see what the actual terms are of Trump's plan for like peace in the Middle East and peace in Europe.
There's so much in play. And you have a president where he knows he's got leverage. He's got 28% of the world economy. He's got 70% of global equity. He's got energy dominance. He knows he's got cards to play. He wants to be a player. He wants to be a person in history. So if you look at Iran, Iran is in its weakest position of 30 years, thanks to Netanyahu. I mean, you've taken out Hezbollah and the leader of Hezbollah. Hamas is the weakest. So the proxies, your first line of defense as Iran, the proxies are by and large gone. The second assumption was that Israel was incredibly vulnerable to any Iranian attack, and Iran wasn't vulnerable to an Israeli attack. The Iranian missiles did not get through, not just Israeli defenses, but also US defenses. But the Israelis got through, and others got through, mainly the Israelis got through the Iranian defenses. They're naked right now in terms of air defense. So the reason they're rushing toward a bomb is that's their third level. That's their last.
It's their last line.
But what does Trump do when he comes in? He says, I want to negotiate. And so, but he knows they're in a position, I mean, whether they'll come and negotiate or not.
That is the wild card. And I would say that there is some regional anxiety because Israel has Iron Dome and there are countries that do not and remain vulnerable in the region. And no one thinks the Iranians are going to come out with 80 to 120 warheads. But if you look at the IAEA report, like there's a potential that they could have 12 devices in like 2 months. And so that is a significant, scary deterrence situation. And so I do think we're going to be in this window of either they take a deal, they get subject to a military strike, or they come out with this crude nuclear device. But I would just say that like even Ukraine, countries that gave over nuclear weapons, you know, it's not always a fantastic track record of being able to like protect your own security.
I'd do the quick thing on Ukraine.
Of course.
I probably spend more time on this issue than any other issue. And the Atlantic Council is known for being a real advocate for Ukrainian independence, freedom, sovereignty. There's an assumption that somehow Trump wants to blow up the transatlantic relation, wants to destroy it, wants to destroy NATO, and will sell out Ukraine to Russia. Spoke to someone pretty close to the Trump camp. I said, this is really a bad signal. I mean, do you have any idea what message this shows the world? The answer was, do you have any idea what it's going to take to get Putin to really come to the table? Okay. But then he's going to come to the table and he's going to think from everything you've said before, he's going to be able to take advantage. He said, do you remember Donald Trump in the first administration? We were only challenged by Putin once. This is not a president that's going to bend to Putin's will. The Europeans know that in the end, a peace deal is going to have to be done together. If in the end, Trump, through his, I guess you could call them antics or you could call them tactics, gets Europe to spend more on defense, gets Europe to deregulate, gets Europe to grow faster, it's going to be a better transatlantic relationship in the end. And I do worry about secondary consequences. I do worry about the signaling because it bothers me too. But I think we all have to calm down a little bit and see where these negotiations go. It's going to take a long time to get to a negotiated anything. And in the meantime, pushing Europe to do more is not a bad thing. And if you look in the Middle East, the territory you know so much, we were talking about that coming in here, all the Middle Eastern leaders were not moving to a very reasonable Gaza answer, but they are now.
Well, I think that's right. I do think, we're seeing this now with Gaza, with the Arab League proposal. It's going to be a, $50 billion plus proposal to rebuild Gaza, having the Palestinians stay there, because I think for the Egyptians in particular, the idea of millions of Gazan refugees in Egypt raises issues about the political survival of the Sisi government. So I do think that this was something where it forced the Arab League to come up with a counter proposal. Like our friend Hadley Gamble, we've had her a number of times at the Atlantic Council, former CNBC, Semaphore Al Arabiya. She wrote this great thing in Semaphore saying, like, this was a way to sort of compel the Arab League to come forward with something credible as a counter proposal. I mean, it was a brutal tactic with the AI video of the Trump statue in Gaza, but seemingly we are at least getting to a counter proposal stage.
I have one question left for you, Fred. While the bulk of us were focused at the end of February on tariffs and President Trump, you wrote a piece about how China in the year of the snake is quietly having a fantastic year. And it occurred to me as I was putting together a couple of questions for our conversation today that historically any geopolitical panel I attended, moderated, or spoke at, the first question for the last decade was on China first. And yet China is now the last thing coming up in the conversation. Is this right? Or are there stories happening quietly in the background that we should be paying attention to?
So Trump started with a 60% tariff threat for China. He reduced it to 10%. He invited Xi Jinping to the inaugural, which I've got to tell you something, no president's ever done anything like that before, inviting your major adversary to have a front seat at your inaugural. And he didn't come, but one of his chief officials did. And he stopped the TikTok ban and put on a 75-day pause. Huge signals to China. We're going to take some pressure off you if you come to the table with us. This coincides with the announcement of DeepSeek. I think the Shanghai index is up 15% on the year, and the tech index maybe even up more. So Xi Jinping had a meeting with Jack Ma of Alibaba and all these other people, and she said, "Oh, that's just performative. The party's not going to let go of control of tech and let go of the companies." And I said, "Yeah, I guess so, but he hadn't done anything performative where he was celebrating them since he took over." And so to ignore this moment, I think it really signaled to them that we want your animal instincts to come out again and please help us grow because we really need your growth. It was also a sign to foreign investors that, these stocks are really down. And this may be worth taking a risk right now instead of paying, overpriced multiples for the Magnificent Seven. Why don't you, do some bottom feeding in Chinese tech markets? So I just put all these pieces together because I thought it was really interesting that thus far in the Trump administration, probably China looks to be the biggest beneficiary.
Folks, if you ever wondered what it's like to be a fly on the wall inside the rooms that influence and guide our world, we've just had the opportunity of hearing what that sounds like. So thank you for your time.
You've been listening to Strategic Alternatives, the RBC Capital Markets podcast. This episode was recorded on March 4th, 2025 at RBC's Global Financial Institutions Conference in New York. Listen and subscribe to Strategic Alternatives on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave us a review and share it with others. See you next time.
This content is based on information available at the time it was recorded and is for informational purposes only. It is not an offer to buy or sell or a solicitation, and no recommendations are implied. It is outside the scope of this communication to consider whether it is suitable for you and your financial objectives.